There's a dark side to up or out. Hey, I am Chuck the bureaucrat, and you've probably heard of the Peter Principle. Trust me, it is alive and well in the Pentagon, along with a similar rule called the Paul Principle. And understanding how these work helps you make your teams much more effective. The Peter Principle is actually the title of a book written in 1969 by a guy named Raymond Hull, and it's based on research done by a Dr. Lawrence Peter. Briefly stated, the Peter Principle says that every employee rises to their lowest level of incompetence. If a person holds a job where they're competent, they're going to get promoted to the next job, which requires different skills and abilities. If that person can learn the skills and abilities, or maybe they already had them, then they'll get promoted again, and they'll have to learn new things. This goes on until the person can't learn the skills required for the new job, and they get stuck there, incompetent, and more importantly, unqualified for further promotion. Imagine a teacher, someone who's good with students and the occasional parent-teacher conference. They get promoted to be an assistant principal. There, they're good with dealing with parents and other teachers, and so they get promoted to principal. But as a principal, they have to deal with the teachers' union and the school board, and they're not really competent at those things, so they don't get promoted anymore, and they just stay at that level in the organization. At first glance, this looks like a huge problem for hierarchies, but it's important to recognize that this is a fundamental aspect of organizational behavior. And in fact, most organizations design their promotion systems specifically to deal with this. One really popular remedy to the Peter Principle is some form of up or out policy, like the military uses. You either get promoted or you leave the organization. Now, personally, I always think this is a little funny because it pushes a person to a level where they're incompetent and then punishes them by kicking them out. You would think that there would be a management process that pushed people to their highest level of competence and left them there as long as possible. But the fact of the matter is that requires a degree of self-awareness with the organization and the individuals that it's not systematically realistic. Anyways, what's all this mean for you working in the Pentagon? Well, the three classes of employment, military, civilian, and contractor, provides a way for the organization to navigate this aspect of humanity. On one hand, you've got the military with their ferocious up or out push. And so, in that group, you've got a lot of 40 to 45-year-olds who are starting to learn where their lowest level of incompetency is. In fact, we talked about this in a previous video. So as the military pushes service members out, civilian and contract jobs can do two things. First, those jobs can match the natural competencies of the people. Some may say their comfort zones. And second, these jobs allow people to continue to serve almost indefinitely while still having opportunities for promotion. If you look around, you're going to see retired colonels happily doing action officer level work as GS-13 or 14s. You'll see them serving as GS-15s, which is the civilian equivalent of a colonel. You'll even see them become SESs, which I always think is neat because they might not have had an opportunity to become a general officer, but they're able to reach the same executive level on the civilian side. Now, sometimes military people get frustrated by civilians because the civilians don't pursue promotion with that same feverish zeal that the military does. In the grand scheme of things, that kind of frustration is unwarranted, but there is another phenomenon similar to the Peter Principle that can negatively affect government civilians. In his classic book, Assignment Pentagon, retired Major General Smith describes something which he calls the Paul Principle. This is when a competent leader becomes less competent over time. They're competent when they first take over, but their knowledge of people and issues and technology, it just doesn't keep up. And instead, they rest on what they know without learning new things. Civilians are far more likely to fall victim to the Paul Principle, but it can happen to military too, especially when they're close to retirement. So what do you do about the Paul Principle? Well, the first thing to do is recognize that this reduction in competency is usually tied to either boredom or burnout. It may look like they're being complacent, but you can't exactly walk up to somebody and say, "Hey, you're looking kind of complacent these days. You want to think about something new?" But you can ask people if they're feeling bored or burnt out, and you can talk to them about finding jobs that provide them more stimulation or less stress. This particularly applies to people who transitioned out of the military about 3 years ago and might not have a lot of experience with making the decision to change jobs based on their own needs. These behaviors are playing out around you in the Pentagon in natural and predictable ways. And if you want to get the most out of people, you have to understand these principles and then treat them with respect and dignity. I certainly remember when I hit my point of incompetence, and it was a relief when senior raters finally started talking about how do you make the most of your strengths instead of trying to turn you into something you weren't. Speaking of strengths, check out this video to learn more about figuring out what your superpower is.